Have you thought this through?
No way will that work.
Are you sure? Is there any money in that?
You'll never make any money doing that. How are you going to pay the mortgage? Just get a job.
You're going to try and sell that? Why can't you be normal like anybody else?
All right.
Were your parents morons too?
The Savvy Entrepreneur to the rescue.
Congratulations. That really turned out well.
Really good job.
I'm going to admit it. I'm surprised.
You know, I wish I thought of that.
I never thought anyone would bet. How did you do that?
I'm so glad you're pursuing your dream.
I wish I had the courage to follow my dreams.
Hello, all you entrepreneurs out there. Welcome to the Savvy Entrepreneur. We are broadcasting on WLCB 101.5 FM from the greater Chicago, Milwaukee area. I'm your host, Doris Nagel. And why am I doing this? Well, because I'm a crazy entrepreneur myself, and I love helping other entrepreneurs. I've counseled lots of startups and small businesses as part of my law and consulting practice over the past 30 years, but I've also started or helped start at least 9 different businesses. And I have seen a lot of mistakes, and I have also made a lot of mistakes. So my passion is to share what I've learned and find other experts and entrepreneurs to also share their insights to help inform and inspire all of you out there. As always, I welcome your comments, your questions, your suggestions. If there's a topic you'd like to hear about, you've got an issue or a challenge, I'll get you an answer or do my best to answer it myself. If you want to be a guest or you've just got a great resource you'd like to share, be sure to email me at dnagel@lakesradio, plural, lakesradio.org. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest for today. Joining me by phone is John Casey of Shamrock Consultants. He spent the last 24 years assessing, coaching, and improving leadership at a number of the best and most successful Fortune 500 companies. But prior to founding that, he was a certified paramedic, a firefighter, and an inspector investigator at Chicago Ridge. From a career that began in manufacturing in 1985, combined with his investigator experience, he found that he really was good at honing in and assessing people and situations. When he received formal training and assessment, he says he's learned the most through his own curiosity. John is here to talk about an important topic today, one that all businesses really need to think about, which is leadership. John's perspective is that leadership is a system. It's a way of thinking and something you're not born with, but that you can get better at. John's favorite expression about leadership is, you cannot fake CPR, you cannot fake passion, and you certainly cannot fake leadership. So with that introduction, John, thanks so much for being on the show today. Welcome to the Savvy Entrepreneur.
Thank you, Doris. Good morning. Hopefully you're having a great day as well. It's always fun when you get a long intro like that, hear people put your career in perspective. So
Right, it's like, who is that? Wow, that's impressive. And it is. So I'm just teasing you, John. So again, thanks for being with us and joining us. You know, this is a topic, leadership, which I think people have a lot of different ideas about what it is and what it isn't. I think everybody sort of intuitively feels like it's important, but I guess my first question is, what exactly is it, and what isn't it from your perspective?
That's a great first question. And again, to go back to that, that's actually one of our own taglines is around changing the perception and the performance of leadership. You know, because I think that's something that folks say is, how do I change my performance? But I think there's also a perception of what it is and what it isn't. That's a little bit confusing, I think, to folks at times. Leadership to me is, the is part is around instilling confidence in others and building their capabilities, whether it's their own leadership capabilities or just whatever tools they might need to do their job. That's what a leadership person's job is. It's more around asset management is the way I look at it, which I think is a different approach than just rah-rah motivation. You know, motivation is certainly a part of it, but it's only going to go so far. It's actually a much smaller part. I'd say it's probably 5 or 10%, where I think folks sometimes think it's 70 or 80%. And what I don't think it is, it's one of the most common questions that I get asked is around what's the difference between leadership and management. And to me, management or being a boss is around telling folks what to do. And it's a bit more autocratic. To me, it's a lot more work. It's a lot more follow-up. And especially if you think about small businesses or any size business, the idea generally is to try and find ways to be more efficient and more productive versus doing more work. So that's just where we come at it.
Interesting. So I think you're right. I think a lot of people think about leadership as being a good boss. And I suppose the way you've defined leadership, if I understand it right, is to be a good boss, you do have to have leadership capabilities, although you might have to have some other things. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that it's all about the tools, and literally the tools lead to the confidence. Confidence is a very important piece of the whole process. And I think a lot of times folks have, I don't want to call it a phony confidence, but a false sense of confidence. And that can be very dangerous, to them.
So are you talking about confidence, instilling confidence in the people around you, or portraying a sense of confidence, or both?
I would definitely say it's both. And I think that the tools will allow you to become more confident. And then I think there's also that confidence that they look to in their leadership and in their style and in how they approach things. And I'll give you an example from a tool standpoint. Go way back to become an investigator. I had to start out as a firefighter. And I'll never forget, because for 2 days before they sent me to the academy, I was a firefighter. So they had me start, in other words, on the job, and I'm working and I have no idea what to do. I was completely and totally terrified. I mean, we went, I can still remember, like it was yesterday, and this is a long time ago. We went on a call, and it was for a car accident, and they were like, just stick with this guy. I was thinking, what else am I going to do? I don't want to touch anything, right? I have no idea what these tools.
I'm going to trip over the hose. I don't know. Set off a siren, push the wrong button. Who knows what?
Oh,
right?
Even worse. I'm thinking I'm going to rip my arm off, right? Because there's all these tools that they're using to take people, to extricate them out of the cars. And
oh, wow, yeah.
And so then these tools all get taught to me. I practice them like crazy. And then all the situations are going to be different going forward. This is very parallel to leadership, in my opinion. The situations will be different, but you're going to have the right mindset and the right confidence in your tools to be able to handle any situation that comes in front of you. And it's an odd example, maybe, but I think it's actually very much parallels leadership.
Yeah. So, all right. So you can be a boss and either have or not have very good leadership skills, but you need other things to be a good boss. So the flip side of that, I think, is, can you exhibit leadership, effective leadership, even when nobody reports to you?
Very common question. We get folks in our workshops even that get sent there by their company, and they'll say, hey, I have no idea why I'm here. I don't have any direct reports. But there's a skill set that's referred to as influencing. And influencing is a very important skill set. And, we think about it, again, in big companies, but also in small companies. Because leadership to me is a way of doing things, it's a way of being, it's a way of operating. And some of that is going to be your ability to influence others. And it's how you treat others. And sometimes it's even how you say things to others or request something from someone else, like a vendor or another business or an employee. My own team has taught me a lot with some feedback around that, and really have helped me over the years just by being good teammates and teaching me about leadership.
I know we're going to dig more into some of the elements of leadership and how you know whether you're good at it or not, but let's talk first about why leadership's so important. I mean, so what if you're not really that great of a leader? You can still make widgets and get them out to customers, right? Without having great leadership, can't you?
You can still operate that way. But again, if you want to be more effective, more productive, more profitable, I'd highly recommend that you have a system for it. Organizations by design, and again, that design is thousands of years old, is critical. I think that organizations are set up to not only have processes, but also to have leaders who help drive the results and help pull the results out of the folks underneath them. And most organizations, if you think about it, if you look at the organizations that are successful and the ones that are not so successful, what's the difference? They could be using the same equipment, they could be using the same processes, but they have completely and totally different results. You could find examples in the world today. We could certainly find examples in business today. And ultimately, it's the success and failure comes down to the leadership. I mean, even a restaurant. At times, you'll see restaurants succeed or fail based on their leadership or their leadership processes.
So it's not really whether their food is good or whether their employees are friendly?
It does come down to it. There's some of that in there, but again, who decides the quality of the food? Who decides that the quality of the food is a very important component that they're not willing to sacrifice?
Right.
Who decides what values? Who decides what values those employees project out to the customers? It begins and ends with the leader or the owner, perhaps, of that restaurant, or the manager of that restaurant. And I just find restaurants fascinating because you can walk in and you can see a well-run restaurant. I look for them in a matter of minutes, and you do see the end result is generally the ones that are well-run are going to be around for a while.
All right. So we've been talking about leadership at a pretty conceptual level, trying to drill down what happens when you don't have good leadership. And maybe we should use your restaurant example. How do you know when you walk in whether a restaurant is well run and has good leadership or not?
So there's a formula that we devised that will go to CEOs. And this could be a CEO of a small company or a CEO of a large company. And I'll use it backwards first. In other words, the opposite way of the way I would look at it with them. But if you start out with a loss of trust, so if you lose trust in an organization, you will lose engagement. And if you lose engagement, you're going to lose productivity or effectiveness or efficiencies. And if you lose those, that's going to completely and totally impact, usually negatively, if it's negative, and positive if it's positive, your profitability as an organization. So in other words, a lot of times I'll start out with a CEO and I'll just say, how do you be more profitable? You want to be more productive. And how do you be more productive? You need to drive engagement and trust.
Okay, so apply that though. Help me apply that to the restaurant scenario. So when you said when you go into a restaurant, you can tell if it's well run, which I'm interpreting to mean that it has good leadership, at least at some level, it's effective leadership, right? So how do you know?
Correct.
How do you know? I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes. As a lawyer, I relate to all this stuff I learned in law school, most of which was pretty irrelevant. But Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he was asked about what is obscenity, he said, I don't know, but I know it when I see it. But I think most people would be that way about leadership. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it. But I think what you're alluding to is much more systematic than kind of sticking your finger up in the air and sort of testing the air and saying, yeah, it feels like good leadership to me.
So going back to your point about the restaurant scenario, great question. What I'll look at a lot of times is I'll probably dive much deeper into it than you might or someone else might in terms of processes and literally looking at how they run and do they have processes and have they given their people the tools to be successful. I'll go back to that in a second. But the first thing that I look at is that level of engagement of that first person that greets you, whether it's if it's a fancy restaurant, right? There's a car park. Then how does that car park address you? How does the host address you? How does your first waitress address you? They're going to do so based on their level of engagement and their trust in the business and the business owner or the business manager. And it's apparent to me within seconds. And if they're not engaged, why are they not engaged? Either they don't have, I mentioned I go back to it, either they don't have the system or the skill set or the tools to feel confident and feel comfortable in what they're doing. There's something from a personal engagement standpoint. Maybe their manager micromanages them. And so that's going to project out to that waiter, that hostess, or whoever it might be, to the customer. I don't know if that hope that makes a little bit of sense. And I always look at right away, why are they disengaged? Is it their system or is it the people above them, the leadership above them, and their system or lack of?
Well, and I guess system would include, if you've just hired the village sourpuss, or Debbie Downer, who's always kind of like that, then that's a failing of the process. If you want to project
Correct.
happy, upbeat, engaged, and you've hired Debbie or Dan Downer, you either have to have a better process for catching those folks before they're hired or calling them out fairly quickly even after you've hired them, right?
I think there's a piece of it that's hiring. That's a great point, Doris. Right? I think that folks look at that, but again, why is Debbie Downer Debbie Downer? And sometimes you just can't change that. But I find frequently that a good leader with a good process can change that. Maybe maybe she doesn't trust management because the last three managers she had at different organizations, as you would say, has nothing to do with your organization. But now we hired her, and what are we willing to invest in her to make her better, from a leadership standpoint? And a leader needs to figure that out. I mean, you can't put all your time into. We have this model. It's around A, B's, and C's, right? And I always say focus on the A's, focus on the people with good behaviors. In other words, if they're good with the customers, et cetera, recognize them for that. Debbie Downer is going to see that, and they're either going to adapt or a lot of times they'll self-select, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But you've created a culture now.
Yeah. I assume there are people who study leadership. And so are there statistics about what leadership does or doesn't do, or classic case studies that have looked at leadership and the importance of this?
There's quite a bit, actually. There's a piece that we use, actually, in some of our literature because it's meant to shock, because it's meant to get, especially executives that I'd say more your mid-sized type companies and up, to get their attention, which is per Gallup, which is a pretty popular polling organization, that there's over $300 billion in losses in the U.S. just due to disengaged employees. And that's not even talking about the cost of turnover. And again, turnover has continued to go up over the past 10 to 15 years in organizations. It's more than doubled, actually. And a lot of folks aren't paying attention to that. I do. It's part of my job. And then if you dig more into the pieces of it, and they do exit surveys, Forbes came out with a number of numbers that I thought were really fascinating. And I want to say it was around 90% of the bosses, when they interviewed them, felt the employees left for more money. And then it was around, and these numbers vary. Forbes is just one of the ones that I pulled, but they're pretty consistent. They're generally going to be at least around 60% of people leave because of their boss.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
Well, what I think is even more fascinating about that is the understanding from the bosses. They believe people are leaving because of money, and the people are actually leaving because of their boss. And also because of and I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I talked about the ABC model that we use, that, recognizing the A's, recognizing the people that do well, because 80% of folks feel that they leave, and again, it's give or take, it depends on the study. I've seen them 79, 82, but it's around 80% leave because of a lack of appreciation, which again, I think that comes down to their boss. So only 60% are willing to say it's their boss. And again, 80% are saying that they're leaving because of a lack of appreciation. And to me, that's something that you need to hold your leadership accountable for. It's very compelling how important leadership really is to organizations, because we don't want employees that we spent money on hiring and training and being part of our organization. We don't want them leaving. That's the impact of turnover.
Okay, so I got to ask though, most companies are run by pretty smart people, and there are these numbers about how leadership affects it, and that points to people's bosses maybe not being effective. Okay, so maybe you have one or two employees and they're outliers, and you could say, well, we didn't really want those people anyway, so whatever they say, right?
True.
I mean, I'm just saying, I'm trying to
There's some favorable turnover. Yeah.
or they just weren't good fits. Maybe that's the more HR sensitive way of saying things. But for whatever reason, at some point, the arrow starts to keep pointing back. But why don't companies putting people through leadership training and getting coaching for them, or whatever they might need, or demoting them, whatever, or maybe they are, I don't know. But why are there still so many bad leaders out there?
Well, there's a couple points there that you hit on. I'm trying to think of which order to really go in. I do believe that there's some folks who are investing in leadership, but this is partly leading to them not investing, is if they don't feel like they got a return on their investment. Because let's just say they just did a workshop or just did a seminar and didn't do follow-up to it, it's not going to be as successful, almost guaranteed. I won't say guaranteed, but probably 98% chance you're not going to have success. I can talk more about that later, but I think that's certainly one piece of it. But then if you go back to the data that we were just talking about, part of the problem there is that 89% of the bosses believe it's a different issue than what the reality is. And again, like you said, they are really smart people, really well educated, but so many of them don't see their own blind spots. They don't see themselves as a part of the situation. And you'll see that in small companies and large companies.
Well,
Folks say, well, we just didn't hire the right people.
But their boss's boss has to see that, or do they not pay attention to that either?
I think that they do, and they assume that someone's taking care of it, but then so if you're going to a boss's boss, so let's say the owner of the company sees, right, and then goes to the VP and says, hey, I need you to take care of this, they assume that they're going to take care of it. And then the problem is the VP says, well, I just need some training for all these frontline people. I don't have any issues. Again, they don't. It's this ability of what we call self-awareness, which is a buzzword I know out there today, in my opinion. And it's this self-awareness that people get lost in, and they don't see their own. So I did a survey. I'll just give you an example. It was around 225, it was at random, kind of just for the heck of it, kind of a survey. But I found that over 80% of people believe they can see their own blind spots. That's a lack of self-awareness. And I think that's an issue that we all have, right? If I said, hey, Doris, tell me a couple things that you do well, you could probably name a few. But if I said, hey, tell me the things that you don't do well, most folks struggle with that. And sometimes they'll go with the safe answers, right? Like I work too much. Or then they'll list
too
those
much attention to detail.
But one of the questions that I can get deeper into in a little bit is just around how much feedback. So it goes back to this self-awareness, and I know again that's an overused word, but it's something we really work on in our organization. Because, for example, if someone says, and I hear this frequently, I'm a pretty good communicator. I'd say I'm a 8 or 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. Be like, great, how do you know? Another example that we use to pull people in, because maybe people might not know what good communication looks like. But if I said, and this is a question I ask frequently now, and it's fascinating, and I could even ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate yourself as a driver?
Yeah, 80% always say they're better than average. I know the study, so I'm not the right person to ask.
Okay. But yeah, literally over 80% of folks are going to say they're either an 8 or above.
Right.
If you've been on the roads recently, I don't necessarily believe that to be true. And
how about mathematical? I mean, 80% cannot be better than average. That's like one of my favorite expressions is 50% of the people are dumber than average. And I once had a lady look at me and she goes, you're so negative. And I burst out laughing because it
never took a statistics class.
There's mathematical things going on here that you can't change. Same with driving. 80% of the people cannot statistically be better than average. It just is not possible.
And then it gets better because, and again, this may not be as applicable for some of our millennials, but Mario Andretti, for example, is considered the best driver of all time. And now if I said, rate your skills on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to the best driver of all time, hopefully folks are going to drop that score. So again, what's the standard that folks are using to measure leadership?
Right.
That's another gap that I think organizations have is they look at their organization and they say, no, it's the market circumstances. It's not our company. And yet here's a company next to them, same market circumstances, that's outperformed them 2 to 1. That's what I was mentioning earlier. That's a gap that people aren't understanding what the standard is. They haven't been exposed to the standard. So they think they're doing okay. We're not doing so bad. I hear that frequently. I'd say, how's your leadership culture? Frequently, though, when we ask the question, that's where we drive self-awareness. Then they start looking for it. And then a week or two later, we'll suddenly get a call back from them. And they'll say, so talk to me a little bit more about this program, right? Because now they're suddenly thinking, well, I just saw what you talked about. And I sat through one of our meetings and not so good.
part of the problem, I think, is even, as you say, the standard, there's a lot of bad examples of bad management in the news and politicians from the film industry all the way down. There's just so many bad examples of management that I think people almost get to a point where they think that's the standard and they're like, well, I'm not as bad as that, right?
If I'm better than bad, am I good?
Right. Right.
And that, Doris, that is what we see frequently in organization. And again, small or large. And it's almost verbatim what they say. They'll say, well, we're not so bad. I'm like, well, that's a pretty high standard to set. Right? I think some folks are dishonest. Really? And you accept that, and I'll ask a CEO that question, or even an owner of a small business, and you're okay with that? You set the standards as the leader. That's what I was mentioning earlier. That's what's critical, whether you're a small company or a large company. You have I guess they're mid-sized or a few $100 million local company, and the CEO was recently talking. He actually did a leadership podcast, and when he was being interviewed, they asked him about when his company turned around, and I was very proud of him because it's over 20 years ago, and they're still growing today. They're still working on leadership today. Think about that. But he said he reset the values in his company and decided this is what's acceptable for values in our organization, and this is what's not. And he said overnight, the results changed dramatically because he started to create a culture. And what I think is more amazing is he's still willing, that mindset, he's still willing to work on leadership for his organization today to try and improve and get better, because he's trying to get better than good. He's trying to get better than great even. He's trying to continue to get better. He's not worried about being better than bad anymore.
Well, John, I have to interrupt you for just a second. We need to take a quick break for station identification and a word from a few of our sponsors. We're here today talking with John Casey from Shamrock Consultants, and we'll be right back. This is Doris Nagel with the Savvy Entrepreneur Show, and we're chatting with John Casey from Shamrock Consultants, who's joined me on the show this week to talk about something absolutely critical to every single business: leadership. So, John, before the break, even though his company was doing well and improving, reset the culture. And I think the point you made before the break, which I want to elaborate on a little bit, was that he was self-aware. Talk about that a little bit more.
So it's difficult to be self-aware naturally. Let's name our blind spots, right? Let's name our bad traits or our bad qualities. I think that what he did was he looked at the organization as a whole and looked at the results and, found that the previous person had been a bit of we call them autocrats. Some people call them dictators. It's more that person that feels everything flows through them. And he saw a style of management that he didn't want to be, which is impressive. I think that's what a lot of us do sometimes. We learn leadership by looking at others and seeing what they do that we like and looking at what others do that we don't like. He decided he wanted to have a values-based company and knew that in his mind, to change the trajectory, he needed to get there. What made him self-aware? I'm thinking about it, and I think it was probably just like my firefighter example, getting thrown into that situation where he felt like, okay, wow, now I'm a CEO. Now I need to run this company. I need to do something different, or I'm going to get the same results that we already had. He sought out some advice and decided to begin to build around values. And when he saw the results come from building around values, that helped lead him to want to be more self-aware going forward. Because now he's seeing, hey, I'm getting feedback. It's a little rough, but I'm able to make changes and I'm able to improve and go forward.
So, I'm curious, not everybody has the same kind of leadership style. The kind of leadership that might work, say, in a military paratrooper unit might not work for a small services company. How do you still have good leadership, but accommodate for people's different styles and the different contexts that they're working with people in?
That's a great question. And the first thing to do, in my opinion, is to develop a values-based leadership approach. And so you mentioned that what that paratrooper does won't work in the quote unquote civilian world, but aspects of it will. They're very values-based. So you need to choose your own values, and your values can be similar, they can be different. Feel like we found some that in business seem to work. But again, definitely to adapt to and begin to have a values-based culture goes a long way towards the success. Values-based is different than, I think you were alluding a little bit there to different personalities and different styles, and you can absolutely have that. There's been so many different styles, but we all agree on a similar value system and a similar way of speaking to each other. So for example, one of our magic points is around accountability, but that's just such a broad word that until you narrow in on it and everyone agrees that this is our definition of accountability, you're going to have struggles, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. I think you're right. Self-awareness is really important, but how do you get people there? I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of clients who think that either they are good leaders or they have people in their organization who think they are great leaders. How do they know whether they're a good leader or they're not a good leader?
That's a great question. Again, it goes back to that point from a self-awareness standpoint around getting feedback and then around establishing a standard and measuring against that standard. So that's what we talked about, for example, when we talked about driving, right? It might be a good idea if you think you're a great driver to get some feedback on what kind of a driver you really are, if you want to change. So I think you asked that, like what's an engagement? We're looking for folks who want to change, and whether they want to change to a different style, they want to change because they're not getting the results they want to get very frequently, but they're looking for change. And so when they're looking for change, they're going to have to take, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to play devil's advocate only because, as you know, we at Globalocity operate in a parallel universe to leadership, which is effective partnering, or maybe it's a subset of it. I'm not sure, but almost everybody, if you ask them, would you like to have better partners? Would you like to be better at partnering with people? Absolutely, I would. Oh, for sure. And I'm sure you get the same thing with companies. If you say, well, would you like to have more effective leadership? People would say, well, of course.
Right.
So
of course we would. Right.
So how do you sort out the people who walk the talk or are willing to walk the talk from those that don't?
That's a good point, in that it's the ability to take that feedback. And taking feedback doesn't mean you smile and go, wow, thank you for telling me that I'm obnoxious, for example, right? But being able to, it's a phase that we call that's acceptance. And I use something that was developed by Abraham Maslow, who also developed the hierarchy of needs. And he designed these 4 stages of competence. Highly recommend people look it up and kind of walk yourself through it. But one of the key pieces to me is we broke out and developed what we refer to as these 5 A's. And it's around, getting the data right in the beginning. So assessing, and then being able to acknowledge that there's an opportunity there. So you said, yeah, we could probably get better at leadership. And then, you get into those key stages, which is around acceptance before you get into adaptability, for example. And acceptance is where most of us get stuck. So if we set a diet, right, and we say, here's our goal for a diet, we get on a scale, we weigh ourselves, we go through this process, and then we get stuck based on the fact that we have to accept that our behavior has to change, that it's us, not them. And that's that moment, that we were referring to. And again, I think it's almost a cliche, talking about self-awareness. What you need to do individually and as an organization is accept that not only do I want to change, but I'm going to change, and I'm going to take the steps, difficult as they may be, to change. And then it really comes down to practice when you get the right formula. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
I agree with you. The acceptance piece is very difficult, and I think the diet or the exercise regimen is a great example. So let's say I know that I have to change my eating habits if I want to lose weight. And I know that if I take another handful of these chocolate-covered pretzels, it's probably not going to be heading me in the direction I want to go. But I do it anyway because then something made me unhappy, so I deserve this moment right now. I guess the
No.
I guess the the analogy I've seen is that in business, a lot of times, there's a crisis, there's a big issue, there's a flavor of the month campaign that comes down
Mm,
from the big boss. Okay, so I understand that my leadership initiative is probably not going to be effective because I've had everybody drop that in favor of some crisis du jour, or that I'm not going to lose weight today. I've fallen off the rails today because I ate a bunch of chocolate covered pretzels and sat in front of the TV instead of getting on my exercise bike.
right.
And I accept that, but how do you get beyond the fact that you understand, you've connected the dots, but things are still not necessarily moving forward?
Great point. I will go back and say, I think you need to get the right feedback. And again, make sure you're measuring it against a realistic standard. And again, that's something that I feel a professional assessor can do for your organization. When we do assessments, for example, we submerge ourselves basically into the organization, and we do what we call live 360. We don't use a survey. So this way we're able to give them real data points. And again, say, look, when you said you were going to diet, you sat and ate the pretzels, right? This was an observed behavior. We got feedback
Right.
that you do this all the time. So you're not going to change. And then we help them see a standard that they can
but I-
actually.
But I want to change, John. I do want to change.
I'm getting there.
So, okay.
And then we'll show you a way that you can change that's easy. Again, and I think that's kind of what Weight Watchers does. But where I think a lot of these programs where they fail, and it's the same thing with leadership programs, because I've gone to training before and I've taken 8 pages of notes and I've gone back to the quote unquote real world. And the first crisis, to your point, that hits me in the forehead, I'm done with that new process. Your brain is going to reset and go back to what you did before, 100% of the time. That's basic, in my opinion, basic psychology. We provide, that I think is completely different, is provide coaching and advisement, which are 2 different things. Advisement is more around literally your day-to-day. Coaching is more around helping the person dig in and understand, how can I take one tool today and begin to apply it, get feedback from my coach, get asked questions. So a coach is not necessarily rah-rah. I mean, if someone needs that, of course, they'll provide that. But it's much more around digging into the depth of who they are and what changes can they make and how can they actually make them. Coaching's awesome. I think coaching intimidates a lot of folks. I use a coach personally, and I will for the rest of my life because I get great benefit out of it. My coach drives me, he'll probably listen to this, but he drives me crazy sometimes, right? And he is very direct with me and gives me feedback and asks me those difficult questions that somewhere in the back of my mind I probably asked myself. But now I'm being asked by a professional and I have to answer. And I think that folks, if they could just grasp and accept coaching more than they do, and whether you're that frontline employer or the person who needs it, or employee, or that person who probably needs it the most, which is generally the folks running the companies, to really just be able to accept coaching and look at it as a great thing, not as a bad thing. Because you're probably thinking, well, why doesn't everyone just have a coach then? Because they look at it as a weakness. That's what we run into frequently. One of the stories I tell them, and it's probably 40, 50 seconds long. I'll try and tell you I'm Irish. I'm going to try and tell you the abridged version, but I went and saw Tiger Woods.
So am I, so I'm probably not going to cut you off. So.
You're probably not going to interrupt me, right? You're just going to sit back, sip coffee, and listen to the story. But I went and saw a young Tiger Woods. This was around 1999, I want to say. And I wasn't a golf fan. But to see a golf tournament, you have to either follow a golfer or stand at the hole. So I stood at the hole and watched all these professional golfers swing a golf club. And they were good. They're all hitting the ball right down the center of the green, right? And this guy comes up there, this young kid, and his swing was so much better than all the other professional golfers. The next morning, and I told you it was an older story, I read the newspaper, and they mentioned that not only did Tiger have a golf coach, but specifically, the person with the best swing in the history of golf had a swing coach. I doubt that person could beat Tiger in a round of golf. In fact, I'd be willing to bet on it, right? The type of approach.
Right.
But he's accepting feedback and advice from someone who can see what he can't see in that moment. That's what a coach helps someone do.
Well, how do you find a good coach? Seems like that's a pretty important thing.
Finding a good coach is very difficult. In fact, I found mine through trying several coaches. I was comfortable with his style. You have to find someone who you're comfortable with their style. You also respect their experience and that they can bring something to the table. It just has to be somebody that makes you comfortably uncomfortable, or maybe uncomfortably comfortable, whichever way you want to look at it. You need to feel discomfort, to really be successful with a coach. You need to feel a little almost edge, but I don't think edge is the right word I'm looking for there.
So is that how your company helps other companies to improve their leadership, is essentially through coaching follow-up after you do these 360 surveys? Or are there other tools you use as well?
Oh, there's certainly other tools. The first thing that we do is the assessment, and it's the step that ironically a lot of times folks want to skip. They say, well, we have a communication problem and we need to get some communication training and some coaching, and we'll move forward from there. And I'm like, well, time out. let's assess what your issue is in the first place. Because 100% of the time we find from feedback from our clients that they find the assessments to be very revealing. There's something that they missed in that assessment that comes out. So for example, they did a 360 at a company on this individual, and they said, it's coming back, she's a terrible communicator. Okay, well, she was in a very important position. So during the process, I went around and interviewed other folks and observed and watched what happened, the dynamics, and we identified that her issue was actually no one trusted her. So she was a phenomenal communicator. Doris, when I sat down with her, I would take notes on her communication style. She was so much better than I could be. I mean, she was a phenomenal style communicator, but everyone was turning her off because they didn't trust what she was saying. And it was because of just some basic gaps that she was having. So to dig deeper into that, I'm never going to reveal who this is, obviously, but it was even what we refer to as almost kind of blind mistrust, in that she was making commitments saying, hey, I'll get back to you. And we call those ghost commitments. And she wasn't even realizing that the other person was thinking, okay, you're going to get back to me in an hour. She'd get back the next day thinking she had dutifully filled her commitment. You see how, and you uncover all this in an assessment. You see all this and you put it all together, and it tells a story. And quite frankly, it's a skill that I use, our professional tools, but I use some of the styles being an inspector, years ago, in that, you look for the story. You don't try to make an assumption and then build facts that support that assumption. It's a big gap that a lot of folks have. And there was a study, I think, out of the University of Illinois about 12 years ago around that a lot of folks, most folks, politically, in business, and just in work decisions, in opinions about people, they establish an opinion and then find data that supports that opinion. And that's not what you need to do in an assessment. You need to gather the information and then establish an opinion.
Isn't that
But I think that's
some sort of bias? One of those, it's not confirmation bias, but something like that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's something I see that happens with written surveys, is that people, if they don't think anything's going to change, that's creating bias to that survey, right? So you wouldn't know that by them filling out a written survey. You would know that about having a one-on-one conversation with a professional who would be able to figure out, okay, there's something behind this, versus they might look at the survey and just go, oh, Bob or Mary, I'll give them 5s out of 5s in every category, right? Which wouldn't be practical, but that's the way they're going to fill it out. And that's a bias on a survey. And then there's also that bias that if I just don't like your particular style of management, and I can tell you countless times in history where that's not been a good idea, that people don't like someone's style, then they'll rate them lower. So they don't like them personally. There's something about their personality, because of their own background, rubs them the wrong way. And yes, to your point, now they've developed a bias, and they're going to answer based on that bias, not what's observed.
Well,
that's the assessment piece.
You do raise an interesting set of questions, though. One is, what if I just don't like my boss's style? Your survey objectively may show that boss, he or she, is actually a very effective leader, but I don't like it. It doesn't fit with me. Does that mean it's actually probably something I should self-select and walk through the door and find somewhere else that I'm a better fit at? I mean, I'm curious.
Not necessarily. That's a great question. Not necessarily, because we teach an alignment tool that very specifically goes into that around how do we try to resolve this, because it has to be 50-50. But the leader to me should take the first 50 and say, okay, there's something in my style that if I value Doris as my employee, right, that I can change about my style to fit what Doris needs in our communication. And there's something about that Doris can probably accept about my style if she understands it. It's simple tools, but they're the way they're applied. So if you understood my intent, you might not question the outcome as much, right? You might not question how I put something if you trust that my intent is good.
Right.
So to me, you start tying it all together, which is, again, the program that we built. We call it a paradigm because leadership, again, this is something I mentioned in the beginning. It's a way of being. It's a way of doing things. And so if Doris is my employee, the last thing I should really want to see is Doris leave. And Doris as an employee knows I don't really want to have to go somewhere else, right? Because the grass is always going to seem greener on the other side of the fence, right?
Right.
And this is an area that I'm amazed that companies don't pay more attention to, because it costs them so much in morale, and which costs them, again, it goes back to engagement and productivity and profitability. Get these folks to work together. It's not that difficult.
Yeah, speaking of engagement, there's been some pretty alarming data out there recently. I wish I could remember the studies that I had seen quoted, but it seems like employee engagement is overall pretty low at a lot of companies if these studies are right. Do you agree with that?
It's dropping rapidly. Yeah, it is, and it's dropping rapidly. And that's something I alluded to earlier when I mentioned frequently the turnover rates of these organizations was doubling, more than doubling. And when you have a tight market, which obviously that's changed this week, but it'll change back. When you have a tight labor market, the last thing you could afford to have is high turnover, because now you have to go out and find good people from a smaller pool. So yes, the data for engagement, if you drew it on an axis, is really coinciding with the amount of turnover that we're seeing and the lack of engagement and productivity. Productivity numbers, if you take out technology and some of our basic process improvements, your productivity numbers have actually stagnated and dropped. So people are actually performing less productively today than really in the past 30 years. So there's a lot of really big alarms going off. Go ahead.
Well, so what do you attribute that to? I mean, so you need engaged employees. I think there's plenty of data, the connection between employee engagement and productivity, for example, or turnover
Yes.
rates among employees. And so you want a more engaged employee base, and you certainly don't want a lot of turnover. You certainly want more productive employees, but why all of a sudden are these numbers going down, do you think?
Again, I think that folks are not, it goes back to the self-reflection point. I think they're looking at it and going, well, I'm not so bad. They're not really digging in and looking at a simple question. One of the simplest I can ask is, what is your leadership culture? That usually stumps a lot of organizations when I ask that question. What truly is your leadership culture? In other words, and when they answer, I'll dig deeper. They might say, well, what do you mean? What's my culture? What's your system? What are you doing to keep people engaged? And again, that's why we teach a system, because it's based literally on data that we find this is what works and this is what doesn't work. So for example, I call them parasites. And one of the parasites, for example, is blame. You'll see that frequently in organizations that struggle or fail or are falling, is that they're very focused on blame. And really, at the end of the day, what's the value of blame? What dollar value does it create? Versus if you go to the other side and get into, do people have trust in an organization? There's various reasons and symptoms, I would say, of trust in an organization. Those organizations with trust are going to perform stronger than the ones without. So there's engagement, but then there's all these spindles that come out of engagement and disengagement.
So I'm curious about your client engagements and the assessments you do. You've alluded to some of the elements of leadership, like communication and building values. Are there common elements of leadership in your opinion?
I do feel that there are common elements. So going back 22 years ago, I developed an assessment process that worked, quite frankly. And so big companies would hire us to come in and assess the people in their organizations on leadership because we were accurate with it. The way I was accurate with it was that I had access to, at the time, thousands of people, and since then now tens of thousands, to be able to see what works when an organization's successful and what doesn't work when an organization isn't successful, and just started building tools out of that. And, where that kind of progressed, telling a little bit of our story, I guess, is I found it a little unfair because the organizations frequently didn't have, going back to that point, these were good-sized organizations. They didn't really have a value-based system that they practiced. So we're holding people accountable to a system that we've never actually introduced to them, which to me seemed a bit unfair. But I also saw an opportunity there. They need these tools to be successful. So that's how we built our organization was, we can assess and help you understand what's there. And now we can also come in with the tools that can help correct those fissures, in your system.
So can you talk in any depth about any of the tools? I know you don't want to kind of give away the store, but to help people kind of go from generalities to more the specific kinds of things you help them work on, I think would be helpful.
Sure, absolutely. So we have an accountability model. It has 7 different points, and I won't necessarily give you all 7 points, but there's different gaps in those 7 points in accountability that would keep me from being as good with accountability as they may keep you from being good with accountability. And then somebody else might, number 4 might be the biggest one to them. And so I'll give you a classic example. We frequently think we're clear with expectations. And something that my group has done is they've really helped me with it because I think I'm clear with expectations. This is what I do for a living, right? Literally. And so I'll give someone an expectation. I'll think it's clear. And then they'll say, go ahead. I probably should. Michelle or Tanya or, Glenn who work for me, tell them back what you think you just heard. And what they tell me is completely different than what I thought I just said.
Yeah.
And it's a basic tool that we use. And if you ask me, we talk about self-awareness. And again, Doris, I do this for a living. This is what's scary, in my opinion. If you would ask me in the first place, do you think you were clear with that expectation? I'd say crystal clear, right? I know I laid everything out to them. I gave them everything they needed. And then somewhere along the lines, it went awry. But by getting feedback right away that it isn't, I obviously want them to be successful. They want to be successful. We're in this together, right? So it becomes but you have to see that you're not doing it first. Otherwise, why would you correct a behavior that you don't see?
Well, but I think maybe the most important thing you've shown is your willingness to get feedback, your willingness to try to change, because I think at some level, everybody understands that we all have biases. We may think that we don't, but everyone has them. And so the thing is you become aware of them, and the fact that you've signaled to your employee team that you do want to get better, you really are trying to listen. You want this to be active listening where they're telling you. I think that in of itself probably opens up a whole lot of doors, because what happens in most companies that I've seen, big or small, is the leader will say X and people will just nod and, oh yeah, it sounds good. And they'll leave.
And then it gets messed up.
And then,
and everyone's frustrated.
You've got 6 different interpretations of it, and departments are fighting with each other about what it really means. So I think that's probably a huge step in the right direction.
Feedback is a critical component. And I'd love to say in those scenarios that I always reach out first and say, gosh, this is really something I need to work on. But it really, to me, took getting feedback from other folks and saying, I don't think you're clear. And sitting back and going, I want to get better, right? I want to change. I want my company to evolve. I personally want to evolve. And when you realize that, you realize you have to change something about what you're doing today to evolve. And you need to figure out A, what that is, and B, get some help with it, because you're not going to change on your own. I hear folks say they're self-motivated all the time, and it's a little disappointing because I'm a very self-motivated person, but I also realize I need help if I want to really change.
Wow, there's a nugget that I hope people are really mulling over. I know I am. John, we're almost out of time. The hour has just flown by, as I suspected it would. Talking about a topic as important and critical, really, as leadership. Let me ask you a last question. If people are interested in connecting with you or Shamrock Consultants or learning more about what your company does, what's the best way for them to reach you?
To reach out via email, which would be jpcasey@shamrockconsultants.com, or to reach out to me on my cell phone. Certainly always a good idea to text beforehand, otherwise I'm not going to answer a call, but I'll even leave that number, which is 630-687-5646. And to me, let's talk. That's one of my sayings. If I have to sell leadership, that's not going to be good. But if you have a question about leadership and you want to talk a little bit more about leadership, it's what I love talking about. I can literally talk about leadership 12 to 14 hours a day. I love it. I live it. I study it. I'm a big proponent of it. It works. So if you want to talk, that's what I'd recommend is reach out and we'll talk.
Well, I want to say again, John, thanks so much for being on the show this week. It was really great having you.
Well, thank you for having me on, Doris. I am a little surprised as well that the hour has gone by. I
It
probably could
goes
have talked to you
by.
for another hour.
It goes by fast. Well, and we might have to have you come back on again to do a reprise. So there's so
Would
much
love
to
to.
talk about with leadership. Again, thanks so much for being on the show. And thanks to all of our listeners for listening in. We hope that you found today's chat interesting and informative. You can listen to an on-demand recording podcast of today's show, along with other free information and resources for entrepreneurs. You can either go to the Savvy Entrepreneur show page at lakesradio.org or my law and consulting website, which is globalocityservicesplural.com. Now, be sure to join us next Saturday when our guest will be Steve Garshow. He'll be talking about another really critical element, which is successful business strategy. He's the president of a company called Foresight Consulting. He's the creator of something he calls Lean Strategic Decision Model, and he's the author of a 2016 book called Stratification, which is about creating and implementing strategy. I know it'll be a really interesting interview. Be sure not to miss it. And until then, I'm your host, Doris Nagel, wishing you happy entrepreneuring.